The third thing you should know about a rocket launch is that it is not new but old, perfectly ancient. Watching those bold pioneers defy gravity in their small vessel was something truly mythic to behold, as if we were seeing fact and metaphor come alive at the same time. It resonated past our logic into our primal subconscious, touching on the essence of what it meant to be human, of our bold, insatiable curiosity, and leaving home for the unknown.
Hello, I'm Peter Barker, and this is Research Comms. What comes to mind when you think of storytelling? Is it something fictional, fantastical perhaps? Maybe just a friend or colleague who's particularly skilled at gripping people with a funny anecdote. Whatever comes up in your mind, it's safe to say that the answer might well not be science. That's because science and storytelling are not often seen as natural bedfellows. Story is more often associated with the make-believe, told for purposes perhaps of entertainment or escapism. It's generally cast as being a million miles away from the strict, truth-seeking nature of science. But in reality, science and storytelling have a lot to contribute to each other, especially when it comes to the communication of science. In this week's episode, we'll be exploring how storytelling can drive clear communication of scientific ideas and concepts to all kinds of audience. And my guest, who will be helping me to do that, is Jessica Fox. Filmmaker, writer, and science storytelling consultant, also known as...
I do call it nerd whispering, which I have to stop calling it that because I don't think my clients really like it.
For Jessica, storytelling is fundamental to our understanding of science and to our appreciation of the role that it will play in shaping our future.
It's primal. It's the way we relate and create empathy and learn lessons and remember our history and communicate anxiety and look to the future in terms of aspirations and what we want to build.
When I spoke with Jessica the other week over Skype, we chatted about how she got into science storytelling, about why stories resonate with us so much, and how researchers can harness the power of storytelling to communicate their ideas. So here it is. I first came across your work through a blog post that I read on the British Science Association website, which was called Why Science Needs Storytellers, which was an impassioned, persuasive, quite urgent sort of call to action to scientists to embrace the power of storytelling in order to communicate what it is they're doing and engage with the public. So I had a little look to see who you were and what you did, and obviously saw that you're a writer. You have a lot of different sort of areas of expertise. You're a writer, a filmmaker, and the thing that immediately popped out was the role that you once had, your past as a NASA storyteller, which was something I didn't even know existed. And for me, when I think of storytellers, I think of that, like sort of ancient art of sitting around campfires, storytellers that used to exist in the past. And then NASA obviously is, I think, of all organizations in the world, kind of epitomizes modernity and the future and so on.
Exactly.
So could you start by telling me a little bit about what that role is?
Sure. Your observation is exactly how I felt too, because NASA was really looking back to the ancient art of storytelling to help them with some very modern problems. So you got that contrast perfectly, and it was an exciting time to be there. NASA at that time was hiring artists to come in, like me, to find innovative ways to help that organization communicate. NASA has a lot of relatable as well as aspirational qualities to their organization. One of the relatable ones is that they're a distributed company. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what that meant starting out. So for people who don't know what that meant, it means they have about 13 NASA campuses all over the U.S. A lot of them are south of the Mason-Dixon line, which is like a big belt that splits the U.S. in half. So they're a southern agency mostly, but all those different campuses across the U.S. have to coordinate for one mission. And in order for mission success to happen, communication is key. So if one campus is creating one bit of the rocket, another campus is doing something else. And then you have the tiers of different specialties within NASA who all have their own language, really, and way of communicating. You have the engineers, and you have the biochemists, and then you have the administrators, and you have the project managers, and you have politicians. So communication is absolutely essential for these missions. And they were just trying to find better ways of communicating, because when they looked at lessons learned from past missions, especially where there was a loss of human life, which you can't get greater stakes than that, they found it was because of communication problems. So NASA is an amazingly proactive organization. They're innovative. And they decided, actually, let's hire some people who are really good at communication, like storytellers, to come and help us. So that's what I was doing there. A lot of people joked with me, and they were like, were you reading like Goodnight Moon to these scientists before bed? And you're like a storyteller for NASA. I was running workshops and working with people and collecting stories and finding their communication problems and trying to find solutions for them. One of the solutions, we did so many things, and it was an amazing chance to get to know NASA. One of the things we did was, and you mentioned, like campfire, old-fashioned storyteller. We hired one of my favorite storytellers in the entire world named Jay O'Callahan. Anyone is interested in storytelling, they really need to know about his work. He is an oral storyteller. So he's someone who doesn't write anything down. He is a storyteller with like a big S, the old school way of doing storytelling. He lives within a community for a while, kind of collects the stories within the community, and then creates like artwork, sometimes a fictional story that speaks to the heart of the community and takes it back to them. And it's a great way to reflect group identity, the lessons that a community's learned. It builds community. It's an incredible thing. And NASA was very fortunate, I would have to say. And they hired him for a massive anniversary. And he did. He lived there for a year. Wow. We went around, helped produce his story. And his story's available online. Yeah, it made Buzz Aldrin cry, which I definitely think should be on like the front cover of the CD.
And you've spoken about a bit about your experiences in the book that you wrote, which is called 3 Things You Need to Know About Rockets. And it's not all about your time at NASA. Obviously, there is a wonderful story. It's about your pursuit of a vision, isn't it, across the Atlantic?
Yeah, I think one of you might agree, but when you get into the world of storytelling, it's because you love it, and I think it also starts like affecting other bits of your life, because I really believe in like the internal call and your internal intelligence and your instinct. It's a lot what drives good storytelling anyway, about where Joe Callahan always says stories are working with energy, go where the energy is. I think life can be a lot like that too. You go where you're curious and go where you're interested, and you follow your instincts. And so I started having a vision working in a bookshop by the sea in Scotland. And when I say vision, my filmmaker part of me, every morning I would have this exercise where I'd listen to music. I'd write scripts based on the music, and the moment the music changed, I'd like throw the script out and start writing another one. It was just a way to build a muscle, really, an exercise.
Yeah.
And I kept on getting haunted by one vision. It kept on coming back, and that was unusual. And the vision was a young girl working behind a bookshop counter. She had a big woolly jumper on. I could see it was raining. She was surrounded by books. There's like a little golden bell above the door, and she just looked beautifully content. And the more the vision came back, it kind of like panned in. And the girl looked up, and it was me, which was very unusual and quite haunting, I have to be honest. So I sat with it for a couple of days, and I eventually ended up contacting a bookshop in Scotland so I could go over there and fulfill that vision, and then a total adventure ensued.
It's a wonderful book, very funny, very uplifting. And what I really liked about it is so it's telling about your adventure, about your experiences as you go and enter this new world yourself. But woven through it are sort of nods back to your time at NASA and your experience as a science storyteller. So I remember when you arrive in Wigtown, which is the town that you go to in Scotland, you kind of allude to imagining what it was like for the first astronauts as they set foot on the moon, full of excitement but apprehension and those kind of feelings you were having. And the book itself, well, the title of the book is taken from the prologue, which is very much rooted in your sort of NASA past. Would you mind reading
Sure. Okay, so the book begins. There are 3 things you should know about a rocket launch. The first is that if you sit too close, you'll be killed by the sound. Crammed into 2 rows of metal bleachers, my fellow spectators and I sat under the hot Florida sun miles away from the launch site, waiting in anticipation for the event. Suddenly, something happened in the distance before us, across an expanse of water. The second thing you should know is that although a rocket launch creates sound waves which are strong enough to kill a person, ironically, the spectator's first impression is one of total silence. Silence as my fellow witnesses and I stared gaping, as plumes of silver smoke, then white smoke, then fire emerged from under the rocket. Silence as an astronaut's wife and child, who stood next to me, watched helpless as the countdown began. Silence is a massive wave, an actual wave sped across the water, fish jumping all around until it reached the shore, and a wall of sound blasted our eardrums. The third thing you should know about a rocket launch is that it is not new, but old, perfectly ancient. Watching those bold pioneers defy gravity in their small vessel was something truly mythic to behold, as if we were seeing fact and metaphor come alive at the same time. It resonated past our logic into our primal subconscious, touching on the essence of what it meant to be human, of our bold, insatiable curiosity, and leaving home for the unknown.
Beautiful. I sadly haven't had the opportunity to see a launch live, but yeah, from the sounds of it, must be a pretty special moment.
It was the one thing I do really, really regret is that my dad, who's an engineer, said, like, while you're working at NASA, the one thing I ask is if you go to a rocket launch, can I please have an invite? I tried so hard. It is very, very difficult, but you used to be able to go and kind of stand by the side of the road and see it, which was equally as awesome.
Amazing. And you speak in that about the sort of the mythic qualities, and that is a good way into talking about, myth and storytelling. And I suppose the issue is that often people don't see science and stories as in any way linked, because stories are sort of something to do with kind of entertainment, escapism. Science is a sort of rigid, rigorous discipline all about truth and facts. But storytelling has been a huge part of humanity in the way we see ourselves for millennia, hasn't it? What is it about? What do myths do for us and stories do for us as people?
Oh gosh, it's a big question. I'm going to break it down in a couple of ways. I would say if we look back, I love the scientific method. I will just put that out there. I don't think feelings or stories should be in the scientific method. I think it's awesome the way it is. And I think science is incredible. But in terms of playing with the ideas that come out of science, our modern culture, I think, is far more rigid in the way we define disciplines than it was in the past. Mm-hmm. So if we look at some myths, for example, in terms of archetypes, we have Daedalus. He was one of the first artist scientists. He was in Greek mythology. He created the Minotaur. And he was someone we even have in history. We have people like Leonardo da Vinci. We call them polymaths. But it wasn't unusual for someone to have to flex muscles in all those kinds of different disciplines. And only today do we get slightly lopsided in terms of what our specialties are. And so I think that being well aware and versed in what makes a good story and how to tell a good story, and actually just be aware, people do it all the time. People talk in story. When I lived in Hawaii, people say we talk story, which is basically to have a conversation. So, to answer your question, what myths give us. So we are natural storytellers. Everyone's a natural storyteller. They have their cadence and their own rhythm, and they're just not aware of it. It's how we communicate with each other, and people love stories. I've never met anyone who doesn't. It's primal. It's the way we relate and create empathy and learn lessons and remember our history and communicate anxiety and look to the future in terms of aspirations and what we want to build. What we get out of stories. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist who helped write Star Wars and has amazing books, he always said that a functional mythology should incorporate the science knowledge of our times. So he really, really believed that for a story to be a proper mythology, a modern mythology, it needs to incorporate the world as we know it. So he looked at the evolution of stories and the evolution of human society and looked at how our boundaries and horizons defined where our stories came from. So the hunter-gatherer society looked at where the sun was rising and setting. As time evolved, a lot of our attention looked towards the land that was beyond our own. Then we started looking at the micro and got microscopes and looked at those things. So nowadays, I think Joseph Campbell, the reason why he helped write Star Wars and his call to arms was asking where are the boundaries of our visible horizons are. And he really believed that they were in space. You might sometimes people might argue they could also be in the Large Hadron Collider and those boundaries of what we can see and what we know. Yeah. But he really always believed for mythology to function, it needs to incorporate the science knowledge of our times. And he felt that what stories did for us, the main purpose of them was communicating the experience of being alive. If you want a simple definition.
Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. And I suppose then also communicates the experience of being alive, and you already mentioned sort of addresses questions about where we want to go as well. I suppose that's another big one, where we want to be in the future, not just sort of spatially out in space, but advances with things like artificial intelligence and so on, debates that really need to be had.
I mean, the three things I can see working with science organizations that are most valuable in terms of why you would want to focus on story. So to bring it down from like the intellectual and just the very pragmatic and practical are, I think, one, a lot of science work contains challenges for the more complicated it gets, the more the layman like me, or even a politician who has like 5 minutes to understand something and is in charge of legislation and where our science goes, finds it very difficult to understand. So I had the honor of being able to be another resident storyteller recently at the synthetic biology lab at Edinburgh University. And they're doing such complicated work with the human genome and synthetic biology. And I did not do well in my biology class in high school.
Likewise.
Last biology class I had. So I think my parents really hoped I'd become a doctor, and that did not happen. So if they could explain it to me, they really could explain it to anyone. And they have to be able to explain it to me, because not only is a lot of this government funding a requirement that you have to do, public engagement. It's no longer called outreach. But the people who are affecting policy, affecting what you just talked about, that aspiration and where we want to go, also need to understand it in like 3 minutes, because they don't have a lot of time. And politicians should be well more versed in science than they are. So that's number one. Being able to communicate what you do is important for the survival of what you do. The second is what you talked about in terms of the aspiration about where we're going, and understanding kind of why you're doing the work you're doing and where you'd want to take the work that you're doing. And then the third, quite simply, is dealing with anxiety. And dealing with communication issues and dealing with people. Robots are not doing the science work. It's people doing the science work, and people are flawed, and they bring in their anxiety with them from their daily job, like daily life, and everything. And they have personal issues with people at work. There is, the more you get down to scientists asking them to tell stories, the first stories often they come up with are nightmares, because there is nowhere for them to out the anxiety about what they're doing or the pressures or anything, because they do a very good job to separate their emotions from their work.
That was going to be my next question, is talking about the kind of process that you go through when you go into an organization. It sounds like maybe the first step is acting as kind of some sort of unofficial therapist, perhaps.
Well, the first, I'm so passionate about storytelling and science, and scientists in general. They are my heroes. That I think you can do so much. The first thing I do is make sure I know what the organization wants. So I go there and just listen and really hear about what their goals are. Sometimes they don't want to know what the anxieties are going on in there. Totally get that. That's fine. Sometimes they just have a mandate to do some public engagement, and that's all they want to do. Sometimes they want to understand what the culture of their organization is. And a lot of the time it's led by grant requirements. But then they get a lot more out of it than they realize when they start going down that path. At NASA, purely, it was about increasing communication and making sure it leads to mission success. And they had their own matrix about how they felt that was fitting or better. Or I think them creating a story that every single person at NASA knows verbatim, like that traveling oral story, is probably one of the best things that they could have done.
And what is it that in terms of when you go into an organization, you learn about what it is that they do, you learn about some of the people there. How do you go about working out what the story is? Because it's more than about what they do, isn't it? It's sort of, that's kind of the whole point. They can probably explain a lot about what they do on a day-to-day basis, but what's their story?
So each organization is different. Sometimes I get hired. I do call it nerd whispering, which I have to stop calling it that because I don't think my clients really like it, but it is apt. Sometimes, like if I'm going to an organization that's not grant funded, that is private, and they're developing a technology, and the technology can be an algae or it can be an actual technology that they probably are looking for more brand help work. And there I go in and I listen to them and I help tell them what their story is. And a lot of it's about reflecting what I'm hearing, and reflecting what I'm hearing that to me lights up those lights that are what story is. It's emotional. It may have metaphor or simile in it. It speaks directly to what they do, and it's easily communicatable, and it makes me feel not bad.
Okay.
Not a
That's
negative
the benchmark. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like a purely positive story, but if it's a meme, if it's something that's self-propagating and gets out there, it can't make you feel like, essentially. So, but it has to be accurate, and they have to be happy with it. When they say it in their own mouths, they have to recognize it and say, that's exactly what we do. That feels right to me. So that is a lot more with the work I do with private companies.
Right.
More companies or organizations like NASA or the Synthetic Biology Lab, recognizing what their story is, I'm a lot more comfortable getting the scientists to tell their own story.
Okay.
Because they are the people who make up that organization.
Yeah.
And they're not trying to sell anything. They're really just trying to identify who they are and what they are. And in doing that, that's a lot more of a complicated process. At NASA, I did this, and at the Synthetic Biology Lab, I did this. I'd spend about 6 months just getting to know them.
Wow.
Getting to know the scientists. My favorite thing to do is, have you ever seen, this might be an American thing, the MTV Cribs?
Yes, I know.
My favorite thing to do with the scientists is go into their office and be like, tell me about that. They have such fun things in the office. I love it. So I start getting to really know them. And, I can't put my finger really on this, but you start getting the shape of a person and the quality of them and what kind of stories they contain. And after a while, you start figuring out maybe what stories might be powerful for people to hear.
And so you've mentioned with the work that you're doing, sort of individual work with scientists, your belief that everybody is capable of telling stories. Everybody does tell stories. Lots of people who work sort of as researchers, as scientists, often, in my experience, consider themselves to be non-creative, so perhaps would not think of themselves as storytellers, which is totally an very unfortunate misconception on their own part of what the creativity they have. But you believe that everybody has the capacity of being a good storyteller. How do you kind of coax that out of people?
So I think I 100%, you're right. I think everybody is a storyteller. Everybody is a storyteller. They're just under-practiced. Most people are just under-practiced. And I think the belief comes from the fact that when you get into the world of storytelling, there are so many people that make up rules. Before we spoke, I brought up a list of books where even Joseph Campbell, one of his recommendations was a very old book. I think it was published in the 1920s called There's Only Two Ways to Write a Story by John Galashoff.
Right.
You have, when you take screenwriting, a really good screenwriter will first tell you, read Aristotle's Poetics, which basically tell you there's 3 ways to write a story.
Okay.
And even old school, there's always people making up the physics of what makes a good story. And maybe there's a time for that. The Moth, if you know The Moth, the podcast from America, it's really, really, really good. They are an awesome storytelling podcast. I don't know how they do what they do, but they get everyday people to tell a story. And each story feels different. It's not formulaic. It feels very genuine to them. And so whatever they do works. But I believe, and what I do with the scientists, is everybody has their own way of telling a story, really their own way of doing it. And at some point, there might be time for finesse later down the process about, okay, skip over that bit, you're repeating yourself, or come back to this bit. But you first have to get to know how the person wants to tell the story. And the more genuine it is to them, the more comfortable they feel and the more empowered they feel to keep on going. And it will never be like how another person tells their story, ever. There's one exercise you can do where someone tells a story and then you get everyone in the room to repeat it. And it is going to be a totally different story, more depending on who's telling it. They pick different images, and the stuff I steal from other people, the one thing that I've stolen from, I hope he doesn't mind, Joe Callahan, which meant something to me when he worked with me doing story. When you're trying to get someone who's really not well-versed at telling story, is you really hold off criticism for a while. And you listen to what's working and tell them about what's working. And just keep on doing that until the whole thing is full of things that are working. And then you can go in and kind of finesse the stuff. But being a good listener and spending a lot of time. And the more they flex the muscle, the less time you have to spend with them.
Just to go back again, I guess you spoke about the the separation, the way in which science and storytelling have sort of drifted. I think in the blog post you refer to them as two lovers who no longer speak. So you're obviously doing sterling work to try to reconcile that relationship. But what would the impact be if we can't get them back together again? I feel like I'm sure every age feels that they're at a kind of pivotal point in terms of the way the future is rolling out. But at the moment, it really does feel like there are directions in which we're going with, whether you're thinking about climate change or the direction in which certain emerging technologies like artificial intelligence are going, that now is a moment at which we really do need to be engaging the public in debates about where we want to be going. If we can't get science and how important is it that we get science and storytelling together in order to make those?
I think it's like completely essential, because it determines whether we're pessimistic about science or optimistic about science helping us solve these problems. And that's everything. That is absolutely everything. I think I'm an optimist when it comes to science because I have taken the time to understand science and I love it naturally. I know a lot of people who are highly suspicious and pessimistic about it for no reason other than a lack of understanding. And that starts determining everything, determining who we vote for and what decisions they make, and whether we let fear rule our sense of exploration or in our curiosity or interest. There's a great quote by Samuel Johnson who said, "Curiosity in great and generous minds is the first passion and the last," which I absolutely adore. And if we could get the general public to that point, that would be amazing. I think for me, though, if I was to create a hierarchy of need in terms of reconciling that relationship, the first would be, who are the decision makers? Who are making decisions about science that are not science literate? Because that happens all the time. And how can we get to them and quickly and get them to a point where they feel way more empowered and knowledgeable to make decisions? And then the second thing I would say is, who are the loudspeakers? So who are we reading? Like, who are these journalists writing? Why are they coming up with the titles that they do? Why are they choosing the stories that they do? If we can also make sure that the loudspeakers are not somehow reporting from a place of sensationalism, but a place of deep understanding of science and what the meaning is, then we can have better access to information.
Good stories then, because I suppose the journalists who are writing those things would often say, well, you know, we're trying to tell a story, we need it to be exciting and engaging. In their minds, they're telling stories, aren't they? But you don't, then it sounds like you don't think that good stories need to be sensational.
Well, almost from what's happening in science now, every single thing is sensational. It's really the way your perspective and the way you couch it. So, you know, there's a wonderful press officer at the synthetic biology lab who showed me the process of how stories get chosen. So from when it goes from a scientific paper to in the press, and journalists don't have a lot of time, so they just look at the title, really. And if they're not interested in the title, they skip it over. So that's fair enough. But if that's the game and that's the process, we have to come up with some really tantalizing titles for things that may be overlooked that are super important to the way we're living. There are so many amazing, interesting people working in science that I have met across the board, no matter what discipline it is, that we have every reason to be optimistic about our future.
Brilliant. What a lovely note to end on. Actually, one more thing, just before we do finish. Are there 3 essential ingredients to a good science story or approaches that people can take if they're just kind of dipping their toe into the waters of science storytelling? Some things that work. I will not call them rules. Helpful things. Some helpful things that you might want to play with that work for me are put the emotion back in. Emotion. For me, storytelling is emotion. Dangling a question in front of the audience is also a fun way to tell a story. And metaphors are really powerful vehicles to tell stories. So a quick example, if I was trying to tell you, say, about a first day at work, and I was super nervous because I came unprepared and I didn't really realize how fast-paced everything was going to be, I'd say, I totally felt like a gopher. I was a gopher. That would be a simile. I was a gopher. I popped my head and I ended up on this huge road and these cars were ramming at me. I couldn't even catch my breath. So something about that image
makes me feel small. The cars, coming up with natural metaphors are an immediate way to tell people how you're feeling. And you might not feel like you have to taint the science because you're talking about something totally different, but emotions are relatable.
Wonderful. Thanks very much to Jessica for taking part. It was a fascinating conversation. Always a pleasure to speak with people who are passionate about science communication and who are approaching it in innovative, fresh ways. The story that she mentioned, Jay Callahan's NASA story, is available on YouTube. I will include a link to it in the description of this podcast. It's about an hour long. It's a phenomenal story, a great way to spend lunch times viewing. So if you'd like to reach out to Jessica to find out more about what she does with her work with science institutions, you can reach her on Twitter @FilmFoxWrite. I will also include a link to that address below. Once again, thanks very much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, that you found it useful. If you did, please subscribe and, of course, leave a review if you feel so inclined. It's very helpful to have. Until next time, bye.